Welcome back. This is VBS College of Jewish Studies. This year we're talking about the American Jewish century. And tonight we're going to talk about a turn, a change, as this century comes to a close, to a change in spirit, both proximately since October 7th and more generally in this last generation. So let's begin together as we do each week. If you'll stand from your seats, turn about and say hello to the folks next to you and beside you and around you. Wish them good evening and welcome. Good. Now, don't sit down quite yet. If you'll stay standing for a moment, we want to say thank you. First, we want to say thank you to Lil and Jess Beim, our spectacular benefactors who make all of this possible. And thank you to God for giving us this opportunity to learn, to grow, and to be together. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shechianu v'kiyamanu v'gianu lazman hazeh. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Please be seated. A generation ago, the Brandeis University Jewish historian Simon Davidovich wrote a very important article that's quoted everywhere. It was called The Ever-Dying People. Davidovich, an historian of Jewish experience, wrote that every generation of Jews since Abraham has believed that they were the last true generation, that the kids just aren't going to carry this forward with the same seriousness that they did, and that there is a deep anxiety, the anxiety of continuity, built in to the culture of the Jewish people. And what Davidovich points out is that the ever-dying people is actually an ever-renewing people. That each generation doesn't abandon Judaism, but changes it. And sometimes changes it in ways that are unrecognizable to their elders. And that is actually the creative process of Jewish survival, not the diminishment of Jewish authenticity. And this is certainly the case here. In 1964, April 1964, Look magazine, which at the time was the second most popular news magazine in North America, published an article called The Vanishing American Jew. Its senior editor, Thomas Newman, gathered up all the extant demographic data, and he applied what was known as sociology then, particularly a law called Hanson's Law. Hanson studied Swedish immigrants in northern states, in Minnesota, and he discovered that immigrant groups in America last 3 generations. The immigrant generation comes from the old country, speaking the languages, wearing the clothes, keeping the custom, eating the foods of the old country. The native-born generation comes. They become American, they speak English, they dress like Americans, but they keep the old ways out of respect for their elders, their parents. The third generation of American immigrant groups speaks the language and is fully integrated, fully acculturated into American life, but because they have Yiddish speaking or Vietnamese speaking or Spanish speaking or Japanese speaking or Swedish speaking ancestors, grandparents, there's at least a touchstone to the immigrant culture, the ethnic culture that came from the old country. By the time you reach the 4th generation, that's when American ethnic groups disappear into what was called the melting pot of American culture. If you go down to Little Italy, there are no Italians in Little Italy. Even in Chinatown, all the chefs are Spanish speaking. It's an amazing thing. We become American over time. And Newman in 1964 said that if you follow the generations, between 1884 and 1920 was the great immigration from Eastern Europe. And therefore, by 1964, you had the beginning of the third generation of American Jews. And that he predicted that by 1980, the American Jewish population would be severely attenuated. And by the year 2000, there'd be no Jews left in America. They'd all have assimilated, like the 10 lost tribes. And of course, the irony is that Look magazine is gone. And we're still here. I mean, and the irony goes on from that. When I was a kid in USY, in this very building, USY was the youth program of conservative synagogues everywhere. When I was a kid in USY, we had a program that knocked your socks off. We would sit in a circle on the floor with one candle, and someone would very reverently read. There was a very famous reading that was circulated around USY and BBG and AZA groups. It was called The Last American Jew. And the guy was a monologue. Here I sit in the Smithsonian Institute, surrounded by symbols of Jewish life, a menorah, a Torah, a yarmulke, because I'm the last American Jew. They all gave it up. Israel is no more, and no American Jews keep their laws. And it ends with this tearful thing, oh God, how could we have forsaken you? Which ironically is what Jesus said on the cross, but never mind. And we sat there and we pledged that we would keep Jewish and only date Jews and only eat Jewish and come to shul once a year or so. Don't we pledge our loyalty to the Jewish people? And I found the reading a couple years ago, and the date is 2014. We've always thought that we're disappearing because things change so rapidly. So if you hear that voice, either in tonight's talk or in 2 weeks, or if you hear it on the streets, just know that, yeah, that's normal. That's what Jews do. They worry that they're going to disappear. That's sort of part of the Jewish game. But in fact, remarkable things have changed. Truly remarkable things have changed. Some of them really benign, some of them really destructive, and many of them, the jury's still out to see how it changes and how we change. And tonight, we'd like to look first at the generational change of this last generation of American Jews, and then take a look more specifically at how October 7th and its aftermath have changed us. We'll begin tonight with Professor Windmuller. You have the, me too. I have it too. There you go.
So the question that launched this course was the article by Malcolm Four in The Atlantic. Is this the end of the Jewish century? Or could it be just a transformational moment, something new beginning? So what we're going to explore at the outset are some of the factors that are contributing both to the possibilities and also to the probabilities, either one way or the other. Lana, how do you turn this on? I'm not a techie.
It is on.
Okay, good.
Yep.
There we go.
Okay.
So the immediate question is the generational transformation, as Rabbi just noted for us. And in so many different ways, we are looking at the issue of why is this Generation Z so fundamentally different, or is it simply a transformational piece to a much broader story? What we do know about Generational Z is, as with millennials, far less likely to be connected to core institutions, both religious as well as civic. Yeah, okay, sure. So Gen Zs are roughly 18 to 35. There's some that may slightly be younger than that, and millennials are roughly 35, 36 to 50. And what we have here are really these sort of competing new stories of a generational picture that is quite different from what we've seen before. So how are they different? Different, one, in terms of what I suggested, institutional connection. Secondly is memory. They did not and have not experienced, for example, the Shoah or Israel, or a host of other life experiences that have defined baby boomers, matures, and other generations older than they. They are part of a community that is very much focused on climate change. Their issues deal with social justice. Their considerations are very much about how they relate one to another, because they're very concerned about relationship building. And they focus often and very frequently on the notion that marriage may be important, but not now. In other words, a kind of delayed response to the idea that necessarily they must marry, and even if they do they necessarily need to have kids? But what we are learning also about generations is something else. The ADL study on Gen Zs, these are not Jewish young folks, this is American young folks, are likely to be more anti-Semitic than any previous generation in the context of post-Second World War communities. So this is what we have sort of come to a very critical moment in understanding. This is a generation, as we will see in the other material we will be introducing, that deals through social media. Its whole network of relationships are not bound by newspapers or television, or not in the context of working with a kind of intergenerational community. Their view of the world and their view of information is through their friends and the social platforms that their friends and they embrace. So the data on anti-Semitism is particularly shocking and very challenging, because they have fewer connections and fewer sort of ties and relationships with groups outside of their own. And that becomes a really interesting and problematic consideration for us. They look at this war, which we will talk about further, and October 7th is something very different from the way we both see, understand, and relate to what has happened, and why that means something different for us than it does for them. So this begins this journey. We have a generational crisis. But we also have something else. We have the rise of individualism. This is a period in American life where people have dropped the collective and moved to the personal. And we all know the work of Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. And Putnam began to sort of search this field of the idea that civil society requires connection, community. And that included PTAs and Rotary clubs and civic groups and synagogues and churches and all the other instruments and institutions that glue people one to another in community. And that has declined. And bowling leagues have also gone out of existence. So Putnam took the term bowling alone. Putnam himself was the president of the American Political Science Association, a professor at Harvard. He marries Jewish, converts to Judaism, and is part of a congregation in Lexington, Massachusetts. He is a personal story of seeing how all of this individuality and sort of isolation and separatism has taken place. And he calls for sacred community, for the rebuilding of community, which is his more recent work, because he sees the need to really reclaim the value of community at a time when people are feeling lonely, isolated, and playing individually. Part of that is the decline of American churches, the decline in synagogue memberships, the shifts taking place in all of these kinds of arrangements. The third factor is the end of loyalty. Now, many of us can trace the fact that we belong to this synagogue or to other institutions because our parents or our grandparents were tied to some of the same kinds of causes and structures and belief systems. Loyalty is very essential to a society. It's the connecting point from one generation to another. But when it breaks down and when we see this sort of ending, this is particularly challenging. And one of the areas we see it dramatically is in elections. More young Americans are registering as independents than as Republicans or Democrats. And that's a phenomenon we did not see in this country, because even party loyalty, we were always Republican, we were always Democratic, simply doesn't hold today. And loyalty has become a sort of lost cause in the context of building community. Generations, the issue associated with individualism, and this question of loyalty. We're also not talking to each other. We've simply stopped those gatherings where we once sat together at Shabbat tables, at Thanksgiving dinners, at other settings where we could talk across the table. Even if we disagreed, we somehow managed to find ways in which we could carry forward conversations. Far more difficult today, far more challenging. And when you lose the trust factor and the civility factor, that is damaging and challenging. Political scientists tell us that from 1970 till today, 50 plus years, Americans have begun to sort of lose this idea of trust in institutions, trust in relationships, trust in community. And part of what we see in the political world is that this trust factor is really unraveling, creating a lot of issues about, I don't believe the other side. And as a result, it is contributing to what we now see happening in our society. It's the end of dialogue. It's the state of loneliness. It's the sense of, I don't really believe in what you are saying and who and what you represent. There's something else happening. As we suggested, the decline in religious affiliation. Between 2019 and 2024, 5,000 churches in this country closed their doors. And what we know amongst some of our synagogues and community organizations is there's mergers, in some cases closure. We see a significant shift today in the availability and participation of Americans in these kinds of religious expressions and institutions. So what we see are seekers and dwellers. Those are folks who hold on to synagogues and to churches and to community. And switchers, people who are moving from one place to another, from one religious group to another, from one institution to another. And then we see the religious nuns. So these are the four categories of what we are experiencing in American religion at large. The dweller who is loyal, committed, generationally a part of the institutions of, likely of their parents, and likely of the sense that they have retain a degree of that loyalty that I suggest is missing from younger participants. The switcher are those folks moving into one religion or another, testing alternative choices, experimenting with the ideas of what religion could be for them. And of course, the religious nuns, which are 1/3 of all Gen Zs, will tell you that they are part of none of the above, none of the religious expressions or possibilities. And the seekers. The seekers are folks who are looking at spirituality, or they're looking at new religions, or they're exploring other ways by which they can define or redefine themselves. So we actually have multiple Judaisms emerging in the 21st century, which we'll talk about later and what that may mean in terms of ways by which Jews are redefining their identities, both through the traditional institutions, but also through alternative channels and opportunities. And this is very much, as we've suggested, a Gen Z millennial experience. And certainly social media. We talked about it in the context of Gen Zs, but social media has fundamentally changed the way so many people engage with news, deal with ideas, build connections that are all, in a sense, virtual, and have fundamentally shifted much of what we are doing. So, both within the context of October 7th, but well beyond October 7th, we began to look at what was happening in the United States starting in 2008. 2008, Barack Obama is elected to the presidency. We would see a huge increase in far-right political organizing, militia groups, neo-Nazi groups, and other kinds of expressions that were responding to the fact that the first African American would be elected to the presidency of the United States, and this was a challenge for many who saw this as a fundamental shift of America into a place that they were not comfortable. In 2012, we began to see a second shift, and there we began to see the rise of what we now call the progressives on the far left in terms of how they have organized and how they have begun to look at the idea of postmodernism. So postmodernism, which you heard about last week in the context of what's happening on our university campuses, is very much in play at the current moment. And what we see happening here is everything that we could have imagined. It's about race. It's about injustice and inequality. It is about intersectionality, of relationships of groups who are perceived as minorities, who are non-white, seeking status, working in a world in which they perceive whites and white power to be dominant and thereby also by definition racist. For the postmodernists, this is a whole set of beliefs that the world in which they have inherited is a world that is unjust and problematic. And case in point is Israel. Israel is seen as a white colonialist establishment created by the United Nations, led by the United States, framed in the idea that this would give white Europeans a place amongst indigenous peoples of the Middle East. And for them and for us, this becomes the battleground in which we are now contending over the question of how we reclaim Zionism and how we defend Israel. So the alt-right and the postmodernists have created this issue for us, as we've talked about briefly in a prior moment. Jews are perceived as white or claiming to be white. And for the far right, the notion is that Jews are seeking to replace them, to replace the white establishment. And for the far left, we recall that their viewpoint is that Jews have given up their minority status and therefore have already become white, and that has created this sort of battleground of Jews no longer holding to their ability to claim minority positions. So we have this extraordinary moment in terms of what we are seeing. Increased hostility directed towards groups, and in particular, we define the concerns we have about anti-Semitism, the issues emerging on the far left and far right that challenge our status and our claims to our citizenship. There are economic challenges that go along with all of this, because we would see in the 2008 economic recession a real shift happening in many parts of American society, including parts of the Jewish community. The whole issue of being able to afford synagogue membership, the whole question about what people could do in terms of budgets when they were out of a job or had fewer resources or were challenged by the economic shifts of the society. And certainly the pandemic of 2021 would be a second challenge to us, as we would see further disconnections and disassociations in terms of membership, affiliation, and participation. And we've begun to look at the measures of the middle class. With inflation and economic transformation, what is happening to the middle class? And how will it survive? And how will it be the essential ingredient of a democratic and open society? And when middle class groups feel threatened or feel that their position in a society is imperiled, it really is a challenge to the democratic core of the society as a whole, because the middle class is the essential piece for such societies to flourish and to grow. We have seen a significant outmigration in some of our larger communities. We see this in the Bay Area, in the metropolitan New York area, and to some degree here in Southern California, where middle class folks are leaving many of the sort of communities that they were part of. Part of that is because work is very different today, and the ability to work in the context of doing things from one's home. So you don't need to be in an office 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. And the computer and technology gives you all of these new possibilities. So as a result, what we are seeing is this outmigration from large urban areas, people looking for a better lifestyle, an alternative way in which to live, potentially a cheaper way in which to live. So where is that outmigration moving? To Texas, to Nevada, to Arizona, to South Florida. And we can measure that by looking at the new congressional seats that are shifting every 10 years and where those seats are going. And states in the South and Southwest are gaining ground as we see the decline of states elsewhere. California, for the first time in its history, in 2020 would lose a congressional seat. And we will lose more of them as we see this population transition likely to continue. So that this outmigration has profound implications for holding a community together, because communities come physically together. And if people are leaving, that creates some challenges and shifts to existing or traditional institutional models. And the redefinition of work, which is so primary to where we are today in the context of the new technologies and the new and alternative forms of how people conduct business, and the ways by which all of this is done through the capacity to be able to be anywhere in the world and yet still manage to be part of your own business environment. So we're going to step back, because what all of this has told us is that there are all these changes. Every piece of it, the generational piece, the economic piece, the individuality piece, all of that is contributing to all of these pieces that have made where we are and what we are talking about that much more significant. But something else has happened in the American Jewish scene that is really extraordinary. In our first session, we talked about the growth of the legacy institutions, the rise of denominations, the creation of our systems of federated institutions. And we would come to 1985 and we would have an extraordinary revolution in this country. Very quiet, it's still evolving. And there are lots of factors as to why in 1985 we began something totally new in the American Jewish scene. We've created 600 plus new organizations since 1985. And many of you are part of those groups as you are part of a legacy group. Mazon, the Jewish Response to Hunger, one example. American Jewish World Service, J Street, the Republican Jewish Coalition, the National Jewish Democratic Council, and we can continue to name these groups. They're in the climate field. They're in the Jewish educational world. They are in the whole Israel advocacy piece. They are part of the political establishment. They deal with questions related to everything from recreation to culture to Jewish studies, and they are part of the new emerging piece of the Jewish community. So why 1985? 5 factors help to explain what this extraordinary new development represents. The first piece is that this is the largest transfer of wealth from one generation to another. The babies who were born after the Second World War by 1985 are becoming the parents, are inheriting the wealth of the greatest generation, the Second World War generation. And they are beginning to rethink the ways by which they want to define who they are and how they want to live and where they want to deliver their dollars and resources. So we see the creation of foundations, family funds, corporate and community-based foundations, so that the largest shift we see is from federations to foundations, from the individual giver who now moves outside of the collective to create for himself and his family their own foundational ways by which they contribute. And this is an extraordinary economic shift in the American Jewish community. It takes decades to evolve, but it has evolved. And so Birthright Israel does not happen because of federations or the government of Israel. It happens because Michael Steinhardt and other funders invest in this project first and then bring it forward to the government of Israel and to the federated system. The second factor is Israel is no longer playing the same way it played in the mindsets of American Jews in 1985. The who is a Jew crisis comes at that moment. This is a period of time immediately after the Lebanon War of 1982, which drew for the first time criticism here in the diaspora of Israel's policies and practices in South Lebanon. And it challenges the established notion we are one people, one destiny, and it raises significant concerns about the unity and cohesiveness of American Jewish belief and practice around Israel. So it is this combination of Israeli-based issues, the wealth issue, and the reality that we have a generation of Jews who are now removed from the period of the founding of the state and from the Shoah to a point in their lives where they are thinking more about what they want to carve and create for a kind of new Jewish expression. So as a result, we see this extraordinary development of new organizations. We also see another shift. We begin to see in these new emerging groups the notion that they would be led by founders who would produce a collaborative kind of construct of community. This was not competition, this was finding partners. So if the capitalist model of the legacy institutions dominated early, then here in this later phase, from 1985 forward, would see much more of an interesting collaborative frame of how to manage the nonprofit sector and work collaboratively amongst and within those groups. There are a number of books that have begun to talk about this period. One of them is written by two rabbis from the metropolitan New York area called Awakenings. And it takes a look at a number of these new expressions of religious and communal engagement. And the other is Judaism in the digital age, taking a look at all of what is happening as well through the lens of these new and alternative frames of organizing. So the Jewish community today is actually robust with these two systems, in a sense, in play. The legacy organizations continuing and the growth of these extraordinary new models funded by donors who are on their own seeking ways to sort of fill a need or describe a cause or to build something that they think is essential for the Jewish experience. So Joshua Stanton and Benjamin Spratt, the authors of Awakenings, suggest in an age of fracture and fragmentation, Americans and American Jews in particular crave new ideas and threads of coherence. The new Jewish awakening before us could help germinate an American awakening as well, lifting ancient technologies of wisdom and community for all. I mean, for them, this is, in their minds, something much larger than simply the Jewish community creating these new ventures, but this is an opportunity to really touch America itself in ways about rethinking how we deliver on democracy and community and organizing. Much of this movement is very privatized. And by that I mean almost half of these groups are platforms, just websites where you can go study a text from Talmud and learn how to sort of master the Talmudic tradition. And other texts dealing with other themes of American Jewish history, or questions related to medieval history, or issues associated with any of the core issues of the Jewish experience, allow you to be personally connecting to those stories and to those parts of the Jewish tradition, which has really shifted the communal frame to a personal or private one, which means that one can walk into any place and have a conversation with someone who has not really been part of the synagogue world, or not part of the Federation world, or not part of any institutional world, but yet will be totally embraced through his or her connections to these private, individualized platforms of learning or of activism. And as a result, we have created another avenue by which people can participate. Last week, Ronnie Wolfson spoke about on virtual Judaism, the rise of synagogues that are now today sort of national expressions. Central Synagogue, Park Avenue Synagogue is two of those outcomes. And the shifts by which some folks are seeing the technology field of being able to turn on one's television or go to one's computer and spend an hour or two or more in connection with a synagogue in New York or something in Detroit or in any other part of the country, that allows you to be Jewish virtually and yet not ever necessarily have to affiliate locally with an institution. What does that mean? And then there's the entrepreneurial piece of some of these new platforms and new groups that are designed to, in a sense, become privatized in the notion that they are charging for services. This has become an income stream and a model for-profit engagement, so that not all of this traditional notion that the Jewish community is there to serve in a kind of non-profit venue has now shifted to a more entrepreneurial and capitalist model. And then there's nostalgia Judaism, the opportunity to go back and to sort of dwell in a period of time and place that allows you to do that as well through any number of these platforms or programs and opportunities. So the extraordinary development here is that we have many more ways to be Jewish, to encounter what it might mean to experience Judaism through these new venues and options. So not all of this should be seen as bleak or problematic. This is actually potentially ways in which we rebuild core institutions, we create more opportunities for Jews to learn, and we provide ways by which people connect. Oops. Just a word. We are also a very different Jewish community today. And the LA Jewish population study of several years ago simply verifies all of this. How diverse we have become in terms of our sexual orientation, the varieties of Jews by color, by ethnic traditions or backgrounds, by choice in coming into our community, and through the multiple family options of how people, through intermarriage and otherwise, have come to this community. So it is a much more complex community than we knew as kids and that we knew from an earlier period in American Jewish history. So this, in a sense, is the summary of all that we sort of talked about. The shifts economically, the shifts socially, in terms of how our populations have changed, how our middle class is being challenged, how the cultural wars of postmodernism and extremism are challenging to our place, the issues of trust, the questions of social and political division, the assault, in a sense, on us and on others in terms of the new anti-Semitism, along with all of the extraordinary opportunities that we've described about the Second American Jewish Revolution, which is the way I describe what I think we are experiencing. When we sit down in a few moments with Rabbi Feinstein, we will be talking about the more immediate issues here associated with Israel and how it fits into this equation, and more directly since the 7th of October. And we will see as well the outcomes of social media that we've just described. And we will further look at democracy and civility and the public order, because unless we are able to preserve that order, sort of the status of minorities, such as the Jewish community, become clearly much more challenging. And finally here, it's the long and difficult task of rebuilding trust in societies and recognizing authority in ways that are positive and enhancing so that democracy flourishes. What we are experiencing in American Jewish life, and what all of this, as we sort of look at this picture of moving forward, is really kind of exciting, as I suggest. We have really moved from a sort of centralized system of organizing to this distributive idea of where leadership sits, how power is manifest. And we see this rise of these extraordinary groups and expressions of Jewish creativity. And this is a bottom-up, outside-in framework that's very different from the legacy models of which we originally developed. And I think it's that agility, that experimentation, that the expectations we have that allow us to see this as something, if managed well, could be really quite extraordinary in moving forward. So at our final session in 2 weeks, we will sort of challenge our panel of folks who are sort of living in the community and working in our community in various ways, how they see these opportunities and these potential possibilities for really recasting the Jewish community in something that binds us in a place and in a manner that we haven't even considered. So, Rabbi, this is the point where you get to challenge what I've said, take us to October 7th and beyond, and put all of this together before we go home.
Good evening. I want to emphasize what Professor Wimmuller has just offered us and how important it is. Because there's a tendency to focus on crisis and to see that crisis is really the cause of our confusion and our difficulty. And what the professor has... Is it on? I think it's on. I'll have to say it all over again. Hang on. What Professor Wimmuller has done for us so effectively... This one doesn't want to work at all. Let's try it again. Come on. No.
Seriously?
New batteries, maybe. Yeah, something. We need something. I'll get this one. What Professor Wimmuller has offered us is an understanding that October 7th and what it has brought us is not solely the crisis we're dealing with. It's actually an immediate crisis that occurs in the context of a much bigger shift and transition, both a shift and transition in American society and a shift and transition within Jewish society. And you can't understand the impact of this event without understanding that larger context of what was happening or what is happening within American society and within American Jewish culture more broadly, and now how October 7th has changed that, has affected that, has energized certain elements of that, and has demanded new things of that transition. I'd like to take a moment, though, and turn around and look not just at Jewish culture and how it's changing in America, but I want to look out at American culture for a moment with you. And I want to begin by reading you a newspaper story, which is a very important newspaper story. This comes from the New York Times on June 19th, 1877. The front page of the paper the right-hand column, which is the principal, the second print. The left-hand column is usually the principal news story of the day. The right-hand column is their principal, the second news story of the day. And it's the headline, the grand headline is, "A Sensation at Saratoga." The subheadline is, "New Rules for the Grand Union." The sub-headline is, "No Jews to be Admitted, dash, Mr. Seligman, the banker, and his family sent away, dash, his letter to Mr. Hilton, dash, gathering of Mr. Seligman's friends, dash, an indignation meeting to be held." Here's the story from the New York Times. I'm not making this up. You can look it up. On Wednesday last, Joseph Seligman, the well-known banker of this city, New York, and member of the syndicate to place the government loan, visited Saratoga with his wife and family. For 10 years past, he has spent the summer at the Grand Union Hotel. His family entered the parlors, and Mr. Seligman went to the manager to make arrangements for rooms. The gentleman seemed somewhat confused and said, quote, "Mr. Seligman, I am required to inform you that Mr. Hilton has given instructions that no Israelites shall be permitted in the future to stop at this hotel," unquote. Mr. Seligman was so astonished that for some time he could make no reply. Then he said, quote, "Do you mean to tell me that you will not entertain Jewish people?" unquote. "That is our orders, sir," was the reply. Before leaving, the banker asked the reason why Jews were thus persecuted. Said he, "Are they dirty? Do they misbehave themselves? Or have they refused to pay their bills?" "Oh, no," replied, this is the New York Times. "Oh, no," replied the manager. "There is no fault to be found in that respect. The reason is simply this. Business at the hotel was not good last season, and we had a large number of Jews here. Mr. Hilton came to the conclusion that Christians did not like their company, and for that reason shunned the hotel. He resolved to run the Union," that's the hotel, "on a different principle this season and gave us instructions to admit no Jew. Personally, he, the manager, was very sorry, inasmuch as Mr. Seligman had patronized the hotel for so many years, but the order was imperative. Mr. Seligman felt outraged and returned to New York in a very indignant frame of mind." No kidding. "He sat down and penned a letter to Mr. Hilton," that's the owner of the hotel, "couched in very bitter and sarcastic terms, also telling Mr. Hilton to publish the letter if he chose so to do so, and informed his acquaintances what had befallen him," and it goes on about a meeting that Seligman held. This was a major crisis in the world of German New York Jewry in 1877. Seligman was the biggest banker in America. Seligman was lending money to keep the city of New York solvent. Seligman, for 10 years, had gone to this posh hotel in Saratoga, which is slightly upstate, and when he got there in 1877, they wouldn't let him in because he was a Jew. You're not shocked. How come you're not shocked? It shocked Seligman. And here's what's interesting about this. Remember a couple of weeks ago when we first started this, we talked about George Washington's letter to the Newport, Rhode Island Jewish community in 1789, 1790. The community was used to send, in Europe, when a new king was crowned or a prince was invested, the Jewish community would send a letter of loyalty to the king. So when Washington is elected president of the United States in 1789, the Jewish community of Newport, Rhode Island sends him a letter pledging their loyalty to him and begging tolerance. And Washington, we talked about this, sends back a letter which will make you cry. In fact, I really recommend you read this at your Thanksgiving table. It's easily found online because it is beautiful. And what Washington says, and by the way, in beautiful literary language, because once upon a time politicians could write, Washington says, "You don't have to beg me tolerance. You belong here just like I do. Your connection to this land, your belonging here is no less than my own. And so there's no reason to talk about tolerance. We are all Americans. We share this land. We share this democracy. I'm delighted to be the president and accept your good wishes and blessings, but we are not unequal. A few years later, in 1836, the French diplomat and aristocrat Alexis de Tocqueville publishes the first volume of Democracy in America, his study of the American experiment. Because the French wanted to know, how come the American Revolution succeeded when the French Revolution did not? And de Tocqueville says that the principal character of American life is an American's ferocious love of equality. The fact that we came to this land and established no aristocracy, that there are castes of people, classes of people of wealth and those of poverty, but there's no one who isn't equal. And at least in certain terms of opportunity, he didn't talk about Africans, obviously, African Americans, but in terms of opportunity, in America, all are equal. And when it comes to our democracy, when it comes to the acquisition and distribution of power, all are equal. This was the great ideal of America. Now, truth be told, that ideal was never kept entirely and purely. Certainly, African slavery was the most egregious example of that. And of course, the treatment of indigenous peoples was an egregious example of that. And every wave of immigration that came sparked a wave of nativism, xenophobia, fear of the other, and prejudice against the new immigrants. What's ironic is that when George Washington wrote those words to the Newport community, Alexander Hamilton, who himself was an immigrant, probably a man of color, and probably a man of some Jewish background, coming from the West Indies as he did, writes an equally vicious article in the press about how we can't accept too many immigrants because we will threaten the homogeneity of this land and threaten its cohesiveness. Every wave of immigration sparked a wave of xenophobia and prejudice. The Irish, the Italians, the German, everyone who came here faced this. In 1877, right? Following the Civil War, Joseph Seligman, this incredibly, if you can call it an aristocrat, this incredibly aristocratic American who happened to be a German Jew, faces exclusion from the hotel that he and his family had vacationed at year after year after year. Year after year after year. It's in the same time, in 1886, that Emma Lazarus, the descendant of Sephardic Jews in America, writes the poem, "Give me your tired, your poor, your wretched masses yearning to be free." And that poem is put on the Statue of Liberty, a gift from the people of France to America in celebration of our bicentennial. The same, 10 years later, a poem is published by Thomas Bailey Aldrich, who is the chief editor of the Atlantic Monthly. And the poem is called "The Unguarded Gates." And I'll just quote you a little bit. "Wide open and unguarded stand our gates, and through them presses a wild motley throng. Men of the Volga and Tartar steppes, bringing with them unknown gods and rites." It goes on. And here's his answer to Emma Lazarus. "O liberty, white goddess, is it well to leave the gates unguarded? With hand of steel, stay those who to thy sacred portals come to waste the gifts of freedom." This dialectic between welcoming the outsider, engaging the outsider, opening the gates to the wretched refuse yearning to breathe free, and American xenophobia, prejudice, hate, nativism, and anti-immigrant sentiment is the story of American culture. It's the story of American culture. There is a whole sociology talking about the question, you'll find this ironic, when did Jews become white? Whiteness is not a matter of pigmentation or melatonin. Whiteness is a question of whether you are accepted as the majority, as part of the majority, right? By the way, you can see this writ large in our culture. If a guy robs a bank and he happens to look like me, they will say the bank robber, age so-and-so, was caught and is. If he happens to be of darker complexion, it will say the bank robber, an African American of age so-and-so. In other words, white is normal, accepted, run of the mill. But if you're anything other than white, they will identify you in the news story because that separates you from the norm. When did Jews become white? When we first got here, we wouldn't. I mean, Seligman's experience was interesting because this is before 2.5 million Eastern European, Yiddish-speaking, garlic-eating, garment-working Jews came from Eastern Europe, right? And Seligman was part of the generation of German Jews who were desperately trying to say to their neighbors, we are of you, we are white. And if you want to see this, by the way, writ large, there's a beautiful little field trip you should take. Next time you're in New York City, go visit Temple Emmanuel. 5th Avenue and 69th Street. It's a beautiful building. It's a magnificent sanctuary. I have Protestant friends who won't pray there because it's too churchy, right? There's a beautiful museum about the congregation, but the way the museum, you want to see the museum, is go into the synagogue and go to the back. And on the back wall is the donation wall. And read all the names. You know them all, right? It's Seligman and Schiff and Wurzburger and Guggenheim and all Strauss, owned Macy's, all of them. And they were German Jews trying to say to their neighbors on the eve of the great and after the great immigration, but we're like you. We're not like them. But this alternation between acceptance and rejection of immigrants, acceptance and rejection of outsiders, acceptance and rejection of people who were not of the mainstream, this is the story of American culture. This really is the story of American culture. Now, our experience is extraordinary, which is what we spent the last 3 weeks talking about. Our experience was extraordinary because we came here and we faced that rejection. We faced bitter prejudice, bitter anti-Semitism when we first came. We, meaning that large immigration from Eastern Europe and even the German Jews who were here before. But slowly over the course of the generations, and particularly in the post-war generation, it disappeared. It disappeared. My father and mother knew that there were neighborhoods you could not move into if you were Jews, right? I remember moving to Dallas, Texas in 1982, and the real estate agent would take us to certain neighborhoods and not other neighborhoods. And I said to her, why can't we go look over there? She said, Rabbi, that's not where you want to live, right? Highland Park, Texas, which is this nice neighborhood just south of Northwest Highway, near SMU, was not a Jewish neighborhood. But in the course of my years, and I was there for about 8 years, a lot of my congregants moved into that neighborhood. The neighborhood's walls came down. The redlining came down to Jews, not to African Americans, but to Jews. And we were accepted into this culture. And we were accepted into this culture to such an extent that we forgot that we ever were not accepted to this culture. One of the remarkable things that's happened over the last year is that so many Jews are experiencing anti-Semitism, prejudice, rejection for the first time in their lives and are surprised by it. My grandparents would not be surprised by what happens. They'd be surprised that it was about, they'd be surprised where it happened because the American university was always supposed to be a safe place, right? There's a wonderful article in this month's Atlantic Monthly by David Brooks talking about how the Ivy League opened up and became a meritocracy. James Conant, the president of the Harvard University, erased the quotas and Jews flocked into Harvard University. Somebody published a great joke on Facebook. He said, I dreamed last night I was speaking to my great-grandfather. And I said, Zeta, there are people at Harvard, there are Jews at Harvard who are in trouble because of the demonstrations against Israel. And Zeta said, there are Jews at Harvard? He said, yes, Zeta, and they're in trouble because of the anti-Israel demonstration. Zeta said, there's an Israel? Because this generation that grew up with Israel since 1982, for example, never knew a world without Israel. This generation never knew anti-Semitism. And it's a shock. It's an absolute shock. And it's remarkable to watch them. It's painful, no doubt.
But it's remarkable to watch them understand that in some ways, the bubble has burst and we are back in Jewish history again. This, of course, is what happened in Israel. In Israel, they're going through a huge identity crisis because the whole purpose of the state of Israel was to remove the Jewish people from that flow of history. And whenever we call October 7th in Israel a pogrom, what we're saying is history is back with a vengeance. And when we look at the anti-Semitism that has risen around us, on college campuses, in the arts, in certain circles of publishing and the arts and writing and music and other places in the media, what we're experiencing is everything that our grandparents experienced like all the time and learned to accept. And we're just experiencing it for the first time, and so it's been a revelation. It's been a revelation. And we haven't yet accepted it. We haven't yet internalized it. We're not quite sure what it means. Part of what, as I said before, part of what makes it so radical is that it took place not where we expected it. I mean, Charlottesville, these guys marching through Charlottesville with torches singing, "The Jews will not replace us," in a certain way, that fits our model of America, right? First of all, it's the South. Oh, and the South, for God's sakes, Rabbi. You know, and second of all, these are working class people who have inherited certain prejudices about Jews, and we learn to accept that. But anti-Semitism on the Harvard campus, anti-Semitism on the University of Pennsylvania is the world's largest Jewish day school, right? On the Penn campus, on the Columbia campus, right? On the Columbia campus, it's just it's astonishing on so many levels. So in Israel, they are going through a tremendous identity crisis. Besides the war and besides the stress and the pain of dislocation and war, there is a huge identity crisis going on within the country, within the culture of Israel. And I suggested, as Professor Windmuller has shown us, the larger context, since October 7th, our Jewish culture is going through a similar kind of identity crisis. I can't tell you how many people call me or have called me this last year. And the conversation always begins the same way. Rabbi, I'm not a member of your synagogue. I never belonged to any synagogue. In fact, I haven't gone to synagogue since I was a little kid, and I haven't had much contact at all with Jewish life. But I never thought I'd see this. Who am I? What do I do? How do I reconnect? Rabbi, can you tell me what's going on? And that conversation happened dozens and dozens of times this last year, and it's been remarkable. Before we get to the discussion, I want to read you one more little piece of text, okay? This is a poem. I actually put a piece of it in the sermon I gave. It's a poem from Israel about Israel's identity crisis, but I think it applies to ours as well. It's a poem from a young poet named Elchanan Nir. And what you need to know about Elchanan Nir is he's not who you think he is. This is not a secular Tel Aviv Israeli. Elchanan Nir is an Orthodox rabbi. Elchanan Nir isn't just an Orthodox rabbi. Elchanan Nir is a Rosh Yeshiva. That is, he's a professor in a yeshiva on the West Bank, in Efrat, on the West Bank. He's a publisher and a writer and an editor and a teacher. Very Orthodox man. And right after October 7th, in the weeks and months after October 7th, he wrote this poem. I'll read you a little Hebrew, then I'll read you in English, okay? I want you to hear the Hebrew, if you know a little Hebrew. And my Hebrew's terrible, so I apologize for this. Akshav kamo avir linshima, anachnu tzrichim Torah chadasha. Akshav betoch avir shenigmar v'tzavar shenimchak. Anachnu tzrichim nishna chadasha, gemara chadasha. Now, like the air that we breathe, we need a new Torah. Now we are gasping for air with choking throats. We need a new Mishnah and a new Gemara, a new Talmud, a new Kabbalah, and a new mystical text. And inside all the brokenness and the pain and the desolation, now we need a new Hasidism and a new Zionism, a new Rav Kook and a new Brenner, great Hebrew poet, a new Leah Goldberg, ditto, and a new Baal Shem Tov, a new art and a new poetry, a new literature, a new cinema, new old words, and new ancient souls from the storehouse, and a new love out of the terrible weeping. For we were all washed away in the rivers of Ra'im and Be'eri. Those are the towns that were destroyed on October 7th. And we have no mountains within us, and no more tablets, and no Moses, and no strength. And now everything is in our hands. What does it say when an Orthodox rabbi, who is an instructor in an Orthodox yeshiva, says we need a new Torah and a new Talmud? It means our community and Israel's community are turning and changing. This event is calling forth a whole reconsideration of who and where we are in the world. Professor.
So October 7th arrives, and the American Jewish community and global Jewry raises an extraordinary sum of money. It is the largest effort at giving that we have ever seen. But what is distinctive about it is that this is philanthropic support from a multiple set of institutions. In other words, it's not centralized giving. We see the American response through the Israel Red Cross, through the Israel Trauma Center, through the Federation System, through JNF, and through a host of other institutions, so that collectively we raise more dollars in those first 3 months than we have ever done before. The second outcome is that just as we heard this poetry, there's this extraordinary transformation of literature, of words, of music, both here and in Israel, as people try to make sense of the moment, try to put some context to what is happening and why it is happening. The third outcome is that we would gather on the 14th of November, 2023, almost 300,000 in Washington as an extraordinary statement of unity and community. We would be involved in this exceptional moment, whereas the rabbi indicates he receives these calls. Well, our schools, our federations, our national agencies, across the board, we are hearing from Jewish professionals that people are asking, how do I reclaim my Jewishness? In what ways can I put my kids and myself back into community? So we have these extraordinary outcomes about something that is happening to us and about us. What has transpired since the first of this year is something radically different. We've begun to see the splintering of our community, the disagreements, the battlegrounds as to how the war is being conducted. Should there be a ceasefire or not? What about the hostages? Where do they fit in the priorities of all that is happening? And then we see the sort of escalation of the conflict. So it's not simply a conflict between Hamas and Israel, but then becomes one that involves other powers, including the Iranians and the Islamic State and Hezbollah. And we see a whole reshifting of the actual conflict. And in the context of all of that, we see our young people, both those on college campuses and what they experienced in March and April of this past year. 147 campuses and literally thousands of folks involved. And what we now know from the FBI and other sources is that much of what has happened or did happen on those campuses were not just driven by the campus postmodernists and anti-Israel factors, but others from the communities, the organizers, and the funders, both from the Middle East but elsewhere in the United States, would make the campus scene a kind of public sort of arena in which this conflict would be borne out on the American side through the university system. And we would see our Jewish faculty members making choices. a number of them at UCLA, for example, directly impacted by the anti-Semitism, the anti-Zionism, feeling it, and for the first time organizing. Because now we have at UCLA a Jewish faculty organizing initiative to respond to the anti-Semitism, to deal with what is happening even in this fall semester. And elsewhere across the country, we would see Jewish students making choices, some of them going with JVP, the Jewish Voices for Peace, others with If Not Now, still others walking back into Hillel, into Chabad, and into Voices of Stand With Us, or a host of other expressions of support for Israel. So we would see this as really changing the fabric and the fiber of much of our community as people made choices and took sides, and the anguish in which all of this plays out.
And just the last point, and I want to talk together, is what I talked about on the holiday. There was an implicit promise, certainly a promise in Israel, and I think the promise was made implicitly here in America as well, that this moment of culture and this political arrangement, this culture of liberal democracy in America and Zionism in Israel, meant that our generation was exempt from the terrors of Jewish history. That our generation was outside of Jewish history. Jewish history was a story of oppression, prejudice, persecution, exclusion, exile. But in Israel, the sovereignty of the state of Israel would protect us, and history has changed. History has changed. The very famous short story by the writer Chaim Chazaz, who came to Israel in the 30s. And he writes this story about, he says, they ask him, he's at a kibbutz meeting, and he says, I want to make a motion that we stop teaching Jewish history to our kids because it's only a history of persecution, and that's not us anymore. And the story ends with a remarkable statement by this one speaker who says that when one becomes a Zionist, one's no longer Jewish, meaning Jewish is about persecution and exclusion and exile, and Zionism is about strength and pride and security. And that was the Israeli promise. In America, there was a similar promise, at least implicitly. And the promise was, it can't happen here. It's different here. This culture is protecting us. This culture accepts us. We are rooted here in ways that Jewish communities were never rooted in their diaspora homes, and therefore we're exempt from that theme, that trope, that meme of Jewish history, of persecution and exclusion and exile. And October 7th, I wouldn't say that it's broken both promises, but it certainly has shaken them. And that's one of the reasons why so many have come back to the community asking, well, what does this mean? Because for the first time in their lives, they come to understand what the rest of Jewish history was really about. And that's where we are right now. Let's take a moment. I'm going to just give you a preview as the professor did before. So next week is Erev Thanksgiving. I want you to go home and make a turkey. It's very important that you do because our pilgrim ancestors landed at Plymouth Rock on 1620 and they ate turkey. And it's a great holiday to celebrate. It's truly a great holiday to celebrate. Following week, we will conclude our series. Our panel discussion will include Matt Barham, who's the wonderful director of Hillel here in the Valley, Hillel 818 at CSUN Pearson Valley College. Mari Chernow, who's the senior rabbi of Temple Israel of Hollywood and a terrific thinker about American Jewish life, and Joanna Mendelson, who's the executive vice president of the Jewish Federation of Los Angeles and formerly of the ADL, and she's a wonderful observer of American Jewish life. And the two of us, and the five of us, are going to try to figure out what's coming next. 5 Jews, 1 prophecy. So come join us in 2 weeks. I'd be eager to hear your reflections on this tonight. So Louise, you want to play? Is Louise here? There's Louise. We can share this mic, and you can take that one around. The only reason we want you to use the mic is because the whole world is watching on television, and we want you, not now, but it'll be up, and we want you to be able to be heard and famous.
I just wanted to give one perspective. When you said about there really was after Israel was founded and we started not having the anti-Semitism that we had endured prior to that, I do remember vividly, though, my late father would tell me stories. He graduated law school in 1953 and could not get a job at any firm because he was a Jew at all. And he had to then, raise his own, sign, and he just became a self, practicing lawyer, because in those years, unless you went to work for one of the Jewish firms and you had to be, top of your class to get into those, nobody was hiring you. So I'm not sure when that shifted.
Yeah.
Maybe the 60s, maybe the 70s. I'm not sure.
It was later than that. Look, there were colleges you couldn't go to if you were Jewish. There were professions you couldn't enter, companies you wouldn't work for, law firms that wouldn't hire you, hospitals that would not let doctors. Why do you think Cedars-Sinai exists? Because you couldn't practice in non-Jewish hospital, right? The neighborhoods you couldn't move into, right? That was the way of that generation. And so for them, anti-Semitism was part of the texture of life. Here's what's interesting, Bonnie, and you and I know this for sure. Your children and my children are now thankfully grown and doing well. Did anti-Semitism affect any personal choice they made? No. Did the college they went to, the professions they entered, the companies they worked for, the clubs they joined, you remember the LA Country Club was restricted. That's why Hillcrest exists, right? Remember the famous joke, Groucho Marx's kids were splashing in the pool at the LA Country Club, and the manager came over and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Marx, but it's a restricted club. You'll have to ask your kids to leave the pool." And he said, "Listen, they're only half Jewish. Let them go in up to their waist, I mean, that was America, the 50s, right? But by the time our kids started growing up, there wasn't, and look, you all remember this. When you came in just now, I have this army of armed people watching the synagogue with very sophisticated metal detectors. That didn't exist 20 years ago. 25 years ago, maybe we had one guy. I remember there was one guy, one very large man, who was he wasn't really so much security, he was sort of a greeter, right? And that was it. I mean, and now to get into a shul, you got to go through a metal detector, past guys with very large weapons. So it's changed, and then it changed the other way. And that's what we're experiencing. Douglas, you have the mic?
Yeah.
Please.
First, my first legal job, I was described as a slice of rye bread in a white bread law firm. But I wanted to talk about the failures of university. And I kind of put that to the oppressor-oppressed narrative and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Yeah. When my kids were going around to the dog and pony shows of Harvard and Penn and Duke and whomever other elite academic institutions were having dog and pony shows in LA, I told them, if you wanted to play a drinking game, that you had to take a chug every time they said the word diverse, you would walk out of every one of those presentations S-faced. And I've asked this question of 2 college presidents that we've had here at Shearers. It's fine that you talk about diversity of immutable characteristics, but you have no viewpoint diversity. And so the college, which is supposed to be a free-flowing exchange of ideas, and the theory behind diversity is people approach problems from different perspectives, and that by coming together, you produce a better result. But if it's this immutable characteristic progressive, and this immutable characteristic progressive, and that immutable characteristic progressive, you have a complete failure. You see that in addition to colleges, you see that in the media. If you haven't read Barry Weiss's resignation letter from the New York Times, that's an example, because the staff of the New York Times is all Ivy League educated. Professor, can you address some of that?
I mean, I think the American university system has taken a big shock, a big hit over these past months, because they simply were not prepared for what was happening on the ground. So the decision of certain university administrators to leave, including presidents at Harvard and elsewhere, is reflective of that. Um, the interesting thing is that there are some other universities that manage this far better, and we don't take a look at some of those places where they understood that, that what was required were conversations that allowed for respective voices to be heard, and there would be discipline in terms of how you conducted yourself. And there were rules. And the irony is that the universities claimed they had these procedures and rules, but they didn't know how to enforce them, and they were overwhelmed in a sense by the fear of their faculty on the one hand, their donors on the other, and of students who were, in a sense, caught in the maze of all of this. So this is a very real moment of revisiting what the role of a university ought to be and how it ought to play out its part of being an inquirer of information and a system whereby values and truths are welcomed and more than welcomed. They are encouraged as against being discouraged by the power of the minority. And I think this is going to take us a while, and we're likely to see some federal interventions moving forward to, in a sense, manage the university systems from outside in as a way to start this conversation and these behaviors.
So you mentioned two different forms of diversity. So there's diversity of, you said, immutable characteristics, race, culture, this kind of. Then there's a diversity of viewpoints. But then there's a third factor, which is meritocracy, which is the best and the brightest. A university seeking not just the diversity, but the best and the brightest, you know. And how does a university manage these multiple competing values, okay? And how do you create an environment which is open to that kind of discussion? I think that what's happening then, I can see this, but it's going to happen slower than we might want it to happen, is a revision, a reflecting on what a university is, how a university works, right? And how much a university is subject to the same polarization that draws apart the culture at large. Okay, that polarization, you know, from left and right, for example, you end up with some very strange kinds of extremes on both sides. I mean, universities are very interesting places because it's supposed to be a thoroughly impractical place, a place of, you know, sort of Platonic contemplation of the forms, and not a place which is terribly practical, and therefore it doesn't have the same kind of streetwise wisdom. That doesn't enter into the conversation. So I happen to think that what's going to happen now is a whole revision of the whole question of what a university is. I think part of that, by the way, is not just driven by the political crises we've just seen, but by technology, right? If you're going to, are you going to pay that many thousands and thousands of dollars if your kid's going to be sitting in lecture classes with, you know, 5,000 other freshmen, or rather sitting at home in their pajamas watching the class on TV? I think you're going to see a really interesting reflection, new forms of American higher education coming out of this generation and out of this crisis. I think that's coming. I think that's going to be happening. That's my vision. I'll just give you one more reflection of this. I subscribe to The Atlantic, and because I like reading it on hard copy, I actually get the hard copy. No, it's actually a very good journal. The back page of one of the editions this last year was an ad from Brandeis University, and the headline was, "In a perfect world, we wouldn't need a Brandeis University." And the ad, it's an ad for Brandeis, said, "Here's a place you can send your kid and anti-Semitism will not affect them." Now, that's not on the back of like B'nai B'rith, you know, or the Jewish Journal. I mean, that Mela, but at the back of the Atlantic Monthly, that was the pitch for enrollment at Brandeis University, which is just such an interesting reflection on where we are in this culture of higher education. And there's a big, I teach kids here, and I teach kids at Milken, and there's a very interesting conversation going on about where do we go to college? Where is it safe? Is it safe to go
to an Ivy League school? Is it safe to go to a state school? Is it safe to, where do you go and where kids don't go? And there's going to be a shift, there is a shift already among where Jewish kids are looking at. What? Yeah, more than, no, there's, at the Atlantic, I think there's more than you might expect. All right, let's get Doug, yes, David.
I find this very tricky. As you're talking, and I appreciate the information and the perspective, I'm thinking back to the Vietnam War. I'm thinking back to when I was in college then, and what was fashionable, and what was and a level of self-righteousness. The thing that when I went to Israel at one point was so impressive to me was that Jews were sitting down with Arabs and trying to have a dialogue to find out how to live together. I thought an extraordinary, and I think of teach-ins back then, in the Vietnam era, and it seemed like I have a neighbor who's progressive. I have several people in my family who are progressive and anti-Israel. Basically, their stand is they're not anti-Semitic. They're they're the people who are justifying the demonstrations. I'm trying to get to the question. It's so difficult not to be self-righteous and not to be tribal and not to be fashionable in this thing that what we're talking about here. And in our country, the isolation you talked about because of social media, people express something. So I'm curious what, if you agree with anything I'm saying, the difficulty of taking a position because it's so easy to be right about it rather than really trying to find a way to dialogue and understand. My neighbor is a sweet guy. I like him. He's a friend. And his progressive point of view, I can't penetrate. That tradition of the underdog, of those people who are being oppressed, and therefore has somehow had a right to commit October 7th, I can't penetrate that.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead. Give it a go.
So one of the extraordinary things that has evolved are the creation of planned conversations, organized conversations. So Setting the Table and other such groups are now in prime play inside the Jewish community. Federations are bringing them in, synagogues are bringing them in, and they're not the only group that are helping people to hold responsible conversations with groups or individuals that they disagree with in an effort to sort of find common ground or to better understand why is this person thinking this way or believing this. So my sense is that there's this energy that's about creating frameworks whereby we can start talking to folks, even folks that we thoroughly disagree with. The progressive world is about 7% of the Jewish community based on all the data we have. It's partially made up of folks who are the children of the old socialists or grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the old socialist world. It's made up of kids who took liberalism and thought of it in a very idealistic frame and now sort of are struggling with the question, well, you told me to be liberal and you said Israel was a liberal democracy and I don't get it, I don't see it. I'm struggling with its behavior or its practices in Gaza as an example. So we've got these very difficult agendas with our kids, with our neighbors, and with others that, see the world through a very different lens than we do. And it's this moment in Jewish life where we struggle to find even the ability to hold those conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Well, what's happened, and sociologists will back me up on this, is that as organized religion has declined, certain political outlooks have become theologies. So, if you ever tried to penetrate the belief of a fundamentalist Christian and try to convince them that I don't really think God is sending everyone like me to hell, right? You can't get through. Well, there are fewer of those people, but a lot more of the people you're talking about who have adopted certain political worldviews that are impenetrable in the same way because it's a cognitive circle. There's no way into that. Impenetrable is the right word. I would suggest two things, just suggestions, okay? Right? Suggestion number one, there's a great rabbi whose work has been on television this last year. His name is Ted Lasso. And Rabbi Lasso has a wonderful principle that he learned from Walt Whitman, which is don't judge, be curious. So if you can ask your opposite to say, let's be curious together. I want to hear your beliefs. I want you to explicate them for me. And I want to examine what don't scream, don't yell, don't object to everything. Just listen. Because once you spell it out, then you see where this person is really, as it were, coming from, we'd say in my generation. A second piece of that, a corollary to that is, anytime you hear Manichaean arguments, one side is all good and the other side is all evil. That you can stop and say, nothing in the world is that way. Everything in the world is much more complex than that. It's not all good and all evil. It's a mixture of both. And everything we know in the world is that way. So let's not get caught in those simplistic, all good, all evil kinds of traps. And once we explore the complexity of these things, then we can come a little closer together. We can agree to disagree on certain things. We can come closer together to realize that there's a problem here that needs to be solved, and all good, all evil Manichaean, that kind of, black and white kinds of thinking is not going to bring us closer to a solution. The third thing that I would basically say to you, David, is I'm learning. I have to go to my wife's family for Thanksgiving, which I enjoy, and I've learned how to listen carefully, to be curious, to reject Manichaean arguments, and to stop and say every few minutes, gee, isn't this cornbread great? Damn, it's better than it was last year. Don't you think so? Because sometimes you can't talk to them. You can't talk to people, right? You can't penetrate this. If someone's going to tell you that the freedom fighters of October 7th are righteous people who are trying to liberate Palestine from the evil Jews by raping young women and murdering, you're not going to talk to people like that. You're going to tell them how much you enjoy the cornbread and turn around and walk away. You're not going to get through. That's a conversation you don't want to have. But if someone is sincere in saying, I really do want to figure this out. I want to hear you. I want you to hear me. And let's see if we can find agreement on certain values. Then I think that there's possibilities for dialogue. Yeah. Sergey.
Okay.
It's almost Ben and Jerry's time, so we're going to, yeah.
All right. Just
Two great prophets of the Jewish people. Yeah, go ahead.
so, my name is Sergio Herrera. I'm a composer, and a few years back, I was seeing this happening in universities, all this anti-Zionism building, and I said, okay, so I have to write something. So I wrote an oratorio called "The Nightmare and the Dream: Herzl and the Creation of Israel," in which I put my perspective on the thing. It's an hour long. And, but what was most upsetting, it was premiered in May, 4 months before May of last year, 4 months before October. And what was most upsetting about it, I am a part of a choir here in the valley called the San Fernando Valley Master Chorale. I'm their composer in residence. And all of a sudden, about 4 or 5 Jewish people in the choir refused to sing it. And that was really upsetting. Later, she didn't say that it was because it was Herzl. She told me, I have family coming, I cannot come to rehearsals. Okay. A year later, I come to her and I said, so why didn't you sing? Why didn't you come and sing with us the story of Herzl? I used historical sources, you know, the diaries of Herzl, the books. I read 12 books. I said, I'm not trying to make propaganda, it's just the story, right? And she told me, well, you know, I don't know, you know, I was brought up in New York. This is a 70-year-old, okay? I was brought up in New York, and we didn't really even believe that there should be an Israel. You know, there were indigenous people there. You know, so really Israel, and I mean, this is, the problem that I have with all these problems is mostly with the Jews that buy into this stuff. You know, this is really, this breaks my heart. Okay.
I mean, I think, as you know, Zionism has really ebbed and flowed in the history of American Jewry, for example, where we lived through periods that many parts of our community rejected Zionism. The Reform movement until well into the 20th century was, you know, outside of that. I grew up in a synagogue in Richmond, Virginia, where we were American Council for Judaism, which means that we were not Zionists. In fact, we were anti-Zionist congregation. So no Hebrew, no Israeli flag, no discussion about Israel. So this is 1948 to 1967. This congregation was totally outside of that world. So you have to wonder how the hell I got on this stage, Rabbi.
I'm starting to wonder that now.
So I think Israel is something that one has to experience. I mean, I don't think that I would have, or anyone of that congregation who did not encounter Israel directly or through some of the literature and the contextual frame of what it means to be Jewish in that environment is particularly powerful and significant. But for folks who are outside of that, there's a total rejection of it. It's fearful to their identity as Americans. It's scary to their identity as what they think is authentically Jewish, or in their minds is their definition of Jewishness. And I think as a result, it becomes very difficult to acquire this unless you really are prepared to ask questions and experience the Zionist idea.
Yeah, it's late enough for me to say something very controversial, okay? I think that there are numbers of people, particularly young Jews, that I've encountered who carry that anti-Zionism, right? Jewish people who carry anti-Zionism. You know, personally, I think that is a complete blindness to the history of modern Judaism and what Israel means to post-war Jews. I think to leave Israel out of the equation of who we are as a people, the development of our culture and our people, is a complete, it's not even a misread, it's a distorted mirror image of who we really are. At the same time, and this is the part that's going to get me in trouble, so you're all going to forget this as soon as I say it, please, is I also think that Jews for whom Israel is their Jewishness, and there's nothing else, is also an aberration. I think that Zionism is a part of a larger feeling of Jewish peoplehood, Jewish culture, Jewish history, I would say Jewish faith, and to make Israel the entirety of your Judaism. And for some people, it's even more narrow than that. It's their anti-Semitism is their entirety of their Jewishness. I think that's also a crime against the richness of Jewish culture and the power of Jewish vision, Jewish faith. And that's also a mistake. I think that's also a mistake. And these are partly mistakes in the way that we've educated a generation. I think it's serious mistakes that we've educated a generation. And I think it's partly a mistake because Jewish parents have very strong feelings about Israel, and they thought that those feelings would be communicated genetically. And they forgot that you have to communicate culture verbally. And they can't really explain it. And what's a remarkable thing is you ask people, tell me what you would want me to tell your kid, why Israel matters to you, and they become flustered because they really don't have it. It's a very deeply emotional thing without a strongly articulated ideology. And I think that's been a very serious problem in the way that we've educated young Jews in this country. Okay? And so I hear you. I understand that. I've had those conversations with people. The last thing I'll say, again, more controversial, so it's later, I can say it now, is that when someone says to you, I hate Israel because it's a white colonial population who came from Europe to displace an indigenous population of people of color for economic reasons, you stop them and say, no, that's not Israel, that's America. It's not Israel you hate, it's America. America was colonized by white Europeans who came here for economic reasons. It's Thanksgiving. I mean, America was colonized by people who displaced indigenous people of color. The Israeli story is much more complicated. There were always Jews living in Israel, and in some places they were the majority population. There were many efforts to live side by side, both on the Arab side and on the Jewish side, to live side by side. Read the letter of Faisal Husseini to Chaim Weizmann, the great Arab leader who said, I welcome my Jewish brothers home again because together we can build a prosperous society and a wonderful democracy. And he was assassinated by Arab extremists. I mean, it's a different history. That's why it's not Manichaean. That's why the history is so much more complex. And it makes me sad when you read treatments of this which are just reducing it to literally a black and white kind of thing. But it's really not Israel they hate, it's America they hate. But it's really hard if you're a sophomore at Harvard to say, and you're white, and your parents are well enough to pay Harvard tuition, to say, I hate America. Because, hell, you are America. So it's so much easier to project that. And I told you it's controversial, see? Okay, one last comment. Judy, do you have the mic? This is the last one because I need to get to Ben and Jerry's before it closes.
Okay. I have
Sacred.
just a couple of things then. And
Just one thing because we don't have a lot of time. So pick the biggest one.
the biggest one is that what happened to meritocracy in the universities? Because I ask this, excuse me, personally, because when my son in, I believe, 1980 was applying to colleges, and he had all the wonderful grades and all the kinds of things like that. And I had, and I still have, black neighbors across the street. And I jokingly said to Joan, I said, if we put Leah, that's their daughter's, picture on his application, he would automatically get into wherever he applied. That's in 1980. And today, I don't know if that's still true, but what I'm trying to say is these waves of who they're going to select, regardless of whether or not it's meritocracy, meaning if they're ready to do it. And I remember going through the, what do you call it, the education process or the interview process. Yeah, application. And the application thing, and talking to people who were the teachers who came into the communities from the different universities. You know, they had designated, they lived here, but whatever. And they said, these freshmen get in, and they're here at Harvard, and they're completely lost because they haven't been educated to be college level, whether it's UCLA, I heard it from UCLA, I heard it from SC, I heard it from everywhere.
Let Steve respond. Meritocracy, affirmative action, diversity, DEI.
So universities are corporate entities. Yes, I know some are state managed and some are private, but they are competing. They're competing for recognition as exceptional institutions against each other because, as you know, they are ranked, and rankings are important for donor support, for achieving higher numbers of student applicants, for getting the best students, and so forth. So universities are modeling behaviors here where if they can draw from the diversity and complexity of America, they can demonstrate that as one of, look, we are fully compliant with Title IX, we are fully engaged with the full diversities of American culture and society and ethnicities. And in that world, they're going to use all of those choices. And right now, which they won't tell you, universities are struggling. Why? Because there are fewer students going to American universities now than we've seen in 20 years. A, because there are other ways to get advanced education, some of which are online. And now you have Phoenix, the University of Phoenix, which is a for-profit structure, which is competing with other initiatives of that type against these colleges and universities. So my sense is this is a combination of economic, demographic, and culture, all of which are driving these changes.
Yeah, and I'm going to reiterate what I said a moment ago. I think American higher education is going to go through a real revolution in the next generation. For nothing, if not for the reasons you mentioned, if not for this argument between diversity and meritocracy, simply on economic basis. What family wants their kid to graduate with a 4-year degree and hold $250,000 in debt? Right? Even if it's subsidized student debt, 2-3% interest, you pay it after 10 years. What are you doing to that kid? How does that, and then if you talk about liberal arts education, so if your kid graduates in computer science, Mela, they got a job, But if the kid graduates in English literature with $250,000 in debt and then moves to New York and gets an unpaid internship at a publishing house, thanks, Mom, thanks, Dad. My white, privileged, colonial, anti-American parents, bourgeois parents. I think that you're going to come to a point where the American culture, the economics of higher education, if nothing else, is going to drive a revolution of what this whole process is for and how it works and how public and private higher education works. We Jews are the most invested in higher education than any ethnic group in America. 89 to 95% of our kids go to college, right? 89 to 95% of our kids go to college. We have way more in our population. Now, the enrollment in Ivy League colleges, Jewish enrollment, has dropped precipitously. I think at Harvard it's down to 7%, was once as much as 20%. The professors, the faculty is still crazy more Jewish. But I think the whole question of what it means to send a kid to college, what we expect them to get from that experience, how much it's going to cost, whether there are other ways to obtain, if not the entirety of that education, part of that education, I think that whole thing is coming under scrutiny now in a very real way. And we'll see where this revolution takes us. Next week, I'm going to wish you a very, very happy and sweet Thanksgiving holiday. Please look up Washington's letter to the Newport, Rhode Island community and read it at your Thanksgiving table. The following week, we'll gather with our panel to talk about what's coming next. Thank you to Professor Windmuller. Thank you to Alana. Thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. Take good care and enjoy.